The ship swallowed him whole. Kael barely crossed the threshold when the doors hissed shut behind him, a sound too final to be accidental. He spun, muscle memory slamming his palm against the hatch panel. The system pulsed red. Denied. Again. Harder. Nothing. Air hung thick. Metallic. Breathing felt louder in the silence. Then, movement. She emerged from the shadows, a slice of violet against the stark lighting. Short, dark hair framed a face cut sharp enough to wound. Her black flight suit unzipped halfway, revealing just enough to distract and disarm. "You're not leaving," she said, voice low, threaded with something dangerous. She stepped forward like she was claiming territory. His territory. Kael didn't move. Didn't blink. His hand hovered near his belt, inches from the concealed sidearm he wasn't sure would matter. "You're exactly what I needed," she added, a smirk curling at the edge of her mouth. Lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering once. He clocked her stance, casual, hands free, but the tension in her shoulders said otherwise. This was no accident. No rescue mission. He knew a setup when he saw one. "Didn't look broken when I got here," Kael said, tone even. "This ship isn't stranded, is it?" The woman's smile widened, almost affectionate. "Smart," she said, circling him now, deliberate and slow. Her presence pressed against his nerves like a wire pulled taut. "I read your profile." A flick of her fingers and suddenly it wasn't just him she was stripping down, it was his record, disciplinary marks, walkouts, outright defiance during planetary evacuations. "You don't scare easily," she noted, tipping her head, studying him like he was a particularly interesting weapon. "You don't know me," he said. "I intend to." Her steps drew closer, soundless except for the steady thrum of the ship's engines underfoot. She moved like a predator sizing up a mate, or a meal. "I put in the service call myself," she said casually, almost playfully. "Coded it to ping you specifically." Kael let the words sink in. "Not chosen by chance. Selected." "So this is a setup," he said, voice low. "A selection." She didn't deny it. He took a measured step toward her. Close enough to smell the synthetic fibers of her suit, the faint electric tang of alien tech clinging to her skin. "You locked me in here," he said. "You planning to tell me why?" She leaned past him, fingers brushing a panel. The corridor dimmed, drowning them in shadow and soft red emergency light. "Not scared yet?" she asked, her voice brushing his senses like fingertips over exposed skin. "Not even close." Her smile deepened. Something electric passed between them, something charged and dangerous. "Good," she said. "You'll need that." Without warning, she turned, hips swaying with controlled energy. "Follow me, Kael," she called over her shoulder. "You don't want to get lost on this ship." Her boots echoed faintly, a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Kael hesitated a second too long. Then he moved, his steps quiet, deliberate. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, each curve and twist designed to disorient. Every step deeper pulled him further from whatever safety he thought he had. When he finally reached the central command suite, she was waiting, hands on hips, legs apart, stance wide and commanding. The doors hissed closed behind him. Her gaze pinned him in place. "Still not scared?" she asked. "No," he answered flatly. "Good," she repeated, circling him again like he was prey she hadn't yet decided whether to devour or admire. "You know what I hate about your species," she said lightly, brushing a finger across his shoulder, a touch both dismissive and proprietary. "You act dominant," she murmured, stepping into his space, so close he could taste the heat coming off her skin, "but when it counts, you fold." Kael didn't flinch. Didn't retreat. He leaned closer instead. Try me. For a breathless moment, the tension crystallized. Thick enough to taste. You're not like the others, she murmured, half to herself. You don't react. Makes me wonder. Keep wondering, Kael cut in, voice steady. She grinned, a real, feral thing, and crossed to the command console. Fingers danced across glowing keys. His entire life spilled onto the screen, childhood, service record, psychological flags, tactical strengths, fatal flaws. He watched her with a wary, simmering patience. You requested this, he said. I did, she replied. You weren't picked. You were chosen. Kael stepped closer, almost nose to nose now. Why me? Her answer was a whisper against his jawline, her breath hot. Because I need a human who doesn't submit. Another beat. Her hand, almost idly, traced the insignia on his sleeve. One who pushes back. Her palm pressed lightly against his chest, feeling the steady, uncompromising beat of his heart. One who can handle me, she said, voice barely audible. Kael didn't pull away. Didn't blink. He simply waited. And somewhere in that silence, she smiled again. Something sharp. Something victorious. And it was only just beginning. The ship's heartbeat deepened. It wasn't literal, but Kael could feel it. A pulse beneath his boots, like the metal skin of the vessel had just exhaled and decided it no longer needed to pretend. The light overhead dimmed a notch, shifting from cold industrial white to a faint amber glow. Warmer. Closer. Like being swallowed. Seryn, he'd read the name tagged to her neural signature, moved to the central console, fingers slicing through light like a conductor commanding an orchestra. The hollow interface flared up, casting her face in flickering blues and oranges. Her voice cut through the hum, sharp and sure. Lock external command access. Manual override, disabled. A moment's pause. Then the ship replied in a soft, sexless voice. Command accepted. External systems locked. Manual override, offline. Kael inhaled slowly. The air had weight now, like the ship itself was listening. You just shut down the only way off this flying trap, he said. Seryn didn't even glance at him. We're not finished. The command deck bloomed into a kinetic map of stars, whole systems spiraling above them in radiant orbit. Streams of encrypted data scrolled along the walls, pulses of alien code like music without rhythm. Somewhere behind it all, a low-frequency hum vibrated through the deck plates. Kael's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. You called me out here for a repair. But this, he gestured at the stellar map, the encrypted feeds. This isn't maintenance. This is insurgency. Seryn pivoted. Her boots made no sound on the command deck, only the hiss of fabric shifting with movement. She approached like a predator in a confined jungle. I called you, she said, because I needed someone rare. Not just skilled. Wired differently. Resistant. You, Kael. She flicked her hand and the galaxy vanished, replaced by a single image, an alien interface pulsing faintly in violet and red. It looked alive, organic and artificial all at once. Kael stared at it. A fragment of high-tier code. But, wrong. Off. Not machine logic. What is that? He asked. Encrypted data, she said. Locked using bioneural encoding. Human pattern required. But not just any human, someone with psychological resistance to suggestive interference. One who disobeys orders. One who won't break when touched. She stepped forward, her breath brushing his neck. The room felt smaller, warmer. A current passed between them, not heat, but pressure. Charged air. Instinct. And you think I'm that guy, he said. Her hand hovered over his chest, fingers barely grazing the surface of his shirt. Not seductive, calibrating. I don't think. I know. He caught her wrist. The contact was firm. Intentional. I'm not your key. I'm not your pawn. No, she replied, eyes locked on his. You're my lockpick. The air changed again. The ship jolted, not violently, but enough to send a vibration up Kael's spine. The AI's voice returned, less serene this time. External tracking signal detected. Proximity breach probable. Unmarked vessel approaching at high velocity. Seryn's face shifted in an instant, steel overtaking fire. She spun back to the console. Scramble signature. Route decoy patterns. Kill outbound beacons. Data cascaded across the screen. The lights overhead blinked once, red running lights activating throughout the deck. Sirens didn't wail, but the tension screamed. Kael braced against the console. They tracked you. She stopped. Her eyes flicked toward him, hesitating. No, she said. They tracked you. Your transport. You're the breach. He didn't respond right away. Then I'm the liability. No, Seryn said, voice lower now, like it cost her something. You're the anchor. And if I go down, you go with me. Kael smirked, bitter. Starting to feel the romance. Seryn didn't laugh. She stepped toward him, quick, controlled, and jabbed 2 fingers against his sternum. You want to live, she said. Then follow my rules. A beat passed. Rule 1, she snapped. You don't run. Rule 2, you don't lie. Rule 3. She leaned in, her breath a whisper against his skin. You listen when I say, touch it. Kael didn't move. You like being in charge, he said. Her mouth curved. I am in charge. Then prove it. She spun on her heel and moved toward a lift at the edge of the command deck. The door opened with a soft hiss. Red lighting spilled down the shaft. Come on, she said, already inside. Kael followed. The lift dropped fast, the floor humming beneath their feet. The walls were tight. Brushed metal, scuffed from use. Faint outlines of weapon storage. The hum of proximity alarms faded. All that remained was breath and gravity. When the doors opened, they stepped into a corridor narrower than before. The lights were low, flickering against smooth panels etched with warning glyphs. An airlock sealed a room at the far end. Seryn keyed in a code without speaking. The door opened. Inside, a single restraint chair, neural interface suspended like a spider from the ceiling. The air buzzed with soft electrical current. No windows. No way out. Kael raised an eyebrow. You gonna torture me now? Seryn stepped into the room. The light caught the sharp lines of her cheekbones, the steady rhythm of her breath. If I wanted to hurt you, she said, you'd already be bleeding. She turned back to the rig. This setup is for neural resonance alignment. Live interface. The data fragment I showed you, it responds to touch. Not just contact, impulse. Kael crossed his arms. Let me guess. Physical. Sensory. Sexual. She met his eyes. Yes. He looked at the chair. Looked at her. I don't like being trapped. You won't be, she said. Unless you resist. Kael stepped forward. Then let's get on with it. He sat. The restraints didn't activate, yet. Seryn stepped behind him. The neural interface lowered slowly, tendrils reaching for his temples, the base of his skull. They hummed, warm and vibrating. The screen lit up. Encrypted data streamed past, symbols twitching, flickering, alive. You're already inside, she said. Kael exhaled. What now? Her hand touched his shoulder. Feel, she said. And the ship trembled again. The hunt was already closing in. But deep inside this locked room, under red light and breathless silence, something else had already begun to unlock. And it wasn't just the code. It was him. It was her. And it was far, far from over. The ship's bones vibrated with a subtle shift in tone, almost imperceptible, but Kael felt it in his spine. A different kind of hum. Not mechanical. Not internal. Predator approaching. Seryn snapped, already halfway back to the console. Confirm tracking signature. Confirmed, the voice replied. Unmarked vessel. Acceleration consistent with strike-class retrieval craft. Estimated arrival, 90 seconds. The temperature dropped. Lights along the corridor flicked to combat red. Shadows sharpened like blades. Kael's fingers twitched, his body instinctively running combat calculations before his mind caught up. Cover points. Field of vision. Worst-case breach angles. He had done this before, on backwater moons and collapsing stations, but never like this. Never with someone like her. Looks like they're early, he muttered. Seryn's eyes were ice now. We move. She turned on her heel and ran. Kael followed, boots pounding against the grated metal floors, the clang echoing like the drumbeat of war. Overhead, exposed piping hissed with steam and flickering lights created epileptic bursts of clarity and shadow. They cut through a narrow corridor flanked with secured compartments, maintenance panels swinging half open from her earlier override. Warning glyphs pulsed along the walls. The ship wasn't just reacting, it was bracing. A high-pitched ping rang out. The AI's voice dropped an octave, almost urgent. Proximity breach. Docking clamps engaged without authorization. Internal systems compromised. Seryn slammed her hand into a side panel. A hiss. A hidden door split open, revealing an armory rack mounted with high-frequency pistols, compact pulse rifles, and 2 black tactical belts. She tossed one belt at Kael. Strap in. You're not just a key anymore. You're in the crosshairs. He caught it midair, clipped it on with practiced speed, and grabbed a rifle off the rack. The weight felt good, familiar. He slid a charge cell into place. How many are we dealing with? Retrieval squads come in 4s, she said. But this one's mine. Expect 5. Kael checked the charge. 5. Got it. Close quarters. She nodded. Fast, armored, silent. No chatter, no mercy. What's their mission? Extraction, she said flatly. Or deletion. Another ping. Breach confirmed, the AI reported. Deck 3. Docking port 7. 2 minutes until full internal system exposure. Seryn grabbed a long blade from a side sheath and slid it into the holster on her thigh. We split, she said. Flank and squeeze. They'll aim for the armory or the bridge. You intercept east. I'll bottleneck them west. Any chance they're here for a peaceful chat? She gave him a look. Only if it ends in blood. Without another word, she vanished down the left corridor. Kael turned right. The sound changed as he moved, quieter, thicker. Like the ship was holding its breath. He passed through a bulkhead and into a storage bay, dark, crowded with equipment crates stacked to the ceiling. Red emergency lights cast shadows in long, crawling fingers across the walls. Then he heard it. The soft scuff of boots. He dropped low behind a crate, weapon raised. His breathing slowed, focus narrowing. A figure moved through the light, bulky armor, visor low. No insignia. No identifiers. Pure function. Kael waited. 1 second. 2. He sprang. The soldier turned just as Kael fired. The pulse slammed into the torso plate, sending the man reeling backward. But he didn't fall. Armor absorbed the first hit. The second hit didn't. The soldier collapsed with a heavy thud. Kael ducked again, moving fast between crates. Another one rounded the corner. Blade up. Close. Kael dropped his weapon and closed the gap in one motion, driving his elbow into the attacker's jaw. A grunt. The knife swiped wide. Kael grabbed the wrist, twisted, slammed the head against the crate wall. Once. Twice. A sickening crack. Silence. His pulse thundered in his ears. 2 down, he whispered. Then a shout, Seryn's voice, echoing through the vent system. A scream followed. He moved. Sprinting through the next hallway, he rounded a bend, and almost collided with a body flying through the air. It hit the wall with a crunch and slid to the floor, unmoving. Seryn stood in the hallway, panting, blood on her knuckles, eyes burning. 3, she said, then turned. Last 2 are heading for the core. Kael caught up. They know where to hit us. They always do. Then let's hit first. They ran. The corridor narrowed, ceiling dropping, walls sweating with heat from rerouted power. Sparks leapt from exposed conduits. The noise of pursuit faded, replaced by the quiet click of their boots, the low grind of failing systems. Ahead, a sealed hatch. Pressure stabilizer hub, Seryn said. If they compromise it, we lose gravity control for half the ship. She keyed the door. It hissed open, too slow. A shot rang out. Kael ducked, pulled Seryn with him as a pulse blast tore through the frame. They rolled behind a support pillar. He caught her eye. She nodded. Flank. He peeled left. She went right. Inside the hub, the last 2 retrieval agents were loading charges onto the pressure core. One turned, too slow. Kael fired. The shot hit home. Seryn leapt from the shadows, blade flashing, catching the last one off guard. The knife found the gap beneath the armor plating, precise, brutal. And then, silence again. She straightened, wiping blood from her cheek. Kael stepped beside her, both breathing hard. The hub pulsed red. Disarm it, she said. He nodded, kneeling. Fingers moved quickly, tracing wires. Charge timers. Circuit breakers. Standard sabotage protocols, until the last wire. Alien. Encrypted. Seryn, he said. This isn't standard. She leaned over his shoulder. Her eyes darkened. No, she said. This was meant for me. Kael stared at her. Then we need to find out who sent them. Seryn nodded once. They're not hunting just me anymore, she whispered. They're hunting us. Outside, the ship's alarms had fallen quiet. But inside, it had only just begun. The quiet that followed the breach was artificial, too still. Not peace. A reset before the next strike. Kael sat at the edge of the diagnostics table, pulse still threading fast through his veins. Seryn paced nearby, her jaw clenched, fingers stained with blood that wasn't hers. Whoever sent them, Kael said, knew exactly where to hit. They always do, she muttered. But this time, there was something else in her voice. Not fear. Not anger. Guilt. The red glow of the alert lights faded slowly, replaced by the sterile pulse of white corridor lighting. Outside the diagnostics chamber, the ship creaked, metal cooling, venting pressure, licking its wounds. Seryn finally stopped pacing. She turned to the console, tapped a command. A map appeared, no stars, no systems. Just a single location pulsing in red. Seryn. Kael frowned. You mentioned that place before. Off-the-record whispers. Black site level. Nobody goes in. Nobody comes out. Seryn nodded. That's where the core archive is. The full dataset. Not just fragments like what you unlocked earlier. He stepped toward the console. The map zoomed in. Defensive rings. Automated tracking satellites. No-fly protocols built into every known NAV system. You're planning to go there. I don't have a choice. What's in the archive? She hesitated. Then, evidence. Of something they've hidden for decades. A genetic control program. Selective breeding. Sterilization of entire military classes. They're thinning the ranks from the inside. Kael's breath hitched. You mean, population control? Specifically male birth suppression, she said. 60% decline in the last 5 years. Soldiers are expendable. So they cull the future. He stared at the red blinking dot. And they buried it in Seryn. She nodded. That fragment you decrypted? It contains access keys to the archive. But the final lock is encoded in bioneural signature, like before. And now. She turned to him, gaze locked. Now I need you. Kael leaned against the console. The screen's glow flickered over his face. You brought me into this without consent. Without explanation. You used me. Her shoulders squared. Yes. But you also protected me, he continued. And you're not asking now. You're telling me everything. Silence stretched between them. Seryn's voice lowered. I didn't know if I could trust you. Or if I should. But after what just happened, we're already in too deep. Kael exhaled slowly. So what's the play? She reached into a recessed compartment, pulled out a sleek, matte black case. Inside were 3 crystalline vials, glowing faint blue. Stabilized DNA archives, she said. One contains military sterilization orders. One has genetic rewrite protocols. The last, projected extinction curves for the next 20 years. He picked up a vial. It was cold. Heavy with implication. You stole these? I defected with them. He looked up at her. You realize what they'll do to us if we get caught? They won't just kill us, she said. They'll erase us. Wipe every record. Make it like we never existed. Kael set the vial back and turned toward her. You said you needed a human mind that doesn't fold under pressure. That won't break when touched. She nodded. Well, he said, voice tight. You found it. A flicker of something passed across her face, relief. Fear. Admiration. He couldn't tell. Then we go to Seryn, she said. Together. Before she could turn away, Kael stepped in. One thing, he said. She raised an eyebrow. If we do this, I'm not just your lockpick. I'm your partner. No more games. No more secrets. Seryn looked at him for a long moment, unreadable. Then she extended her hand. Partners, she said. He took it. The ship rumbled below them, as if it too had just accepted a pact. Beyond the hull, the void waited. Cold. Vast. And somewhere in that dark, Seryn pulsed. Waiting to be broken open. Heat hit like a hammer. The moment the lower deck hatch opened, a wave of scalding air slapped Kael in the face. The corridor beyond glowed orange, emergency lighting filtered through haze and steam. Pipes hissed like angry serpents overhead. Every surface radiated warmth. The ship was sweating. We're losing coolant fast, Seryn growled, already peeling off her jacket. Beneath it, she wore a fitted black underlayer, slick with heat, clinging to muscle and curve alike. Kael followed her through the crawlspace access tunnel, the tight metal shaft vibrating from stress fractures and vent pressure. The further they went, the hotter it got. By the time they reached Engineering Deck 9, Kael's shirt was half unbuttoned, sweat tracing lines down his back. The chamber ahead was pulsing red, overload alarms flashing like heartbeats. Steam vented in sharp bursts from ruptured lines. A console at the far end sparked and flickered, partially melted. "Looks like hell," Kael muttered. "Hell would be cooler," Seryn replied, tying her hair back with a strip of fabric torn from her sleeve. "That manifold's going to blow if we don't reroute pressure." She yanked open a control panel and started working the relays. Kael scanned the area, spotting the ventilation shaft. "You want me in there?" he asked. "You're smaller," she said. "Tighter fit. Manual valve release. Should be just inside. Go." He nodded once, shrugged off the rest of his shirt, and dove into the shaft. It was worse inside. The metal walls burned against his bare arms as he crawled. Steam burst from cracked seams, fogging his vision. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, knuckles scraping the steel. He reached the auxiliary node, clogged with melted sealant and sabotage. "Found it," he called. Seryn's voice crackled back through the relay. "Pressure cycling in 5 seconds. Clear that blockage or the whole deck cooks." Kael didn't answer. He wedged his fingers around the melted obstruction and yanked. It hissed, burned. He didn't scream. Just clenched his jaw and pulled. A burst of steam blasted over his arms, blistering hot. He ripped the blockage free and slammed the pressure release valve. The vent opened with a thunderous whoosh, and a wave of cool air surged into the shaft. Kael collapsed against the grating, breath ragged, face soaked. When he slid out of the shaft, Seryn was crouched at the console, tapping in override sequences. She turned as he landed beside her. Her eyes locked onto the burns along his arms. "You're reckless," she snapped, grabbing his wrists and inspecting the damage. "I'm fine," he muttered. "You could have lost your hands. Then you'd have to find a new lockpick." She didn't laugh. Her hands stayed on him, trailing up his arms, fingertips brushing the new raw skin. Her eyes darkened. "You're hot," she said quietly. "Just the environment," he replied. Her hand moved to his chest, open-palmed. Her fingers splayed over his heart. "No," she whispered. "Not just that." For a moment, neither moved. Then, gently, she pressed her forehead to his. The steam hissed. The ship exhaled. He didn't pull away. She kissed him, not fire this time, but something slower. Deeper. As if grounding herself in the one thing not overheating or falling apart. When they pulled apart, her lips hovered near his ear. "You passed the test," she said. He smirked, out of breath. "Wasn't aware I was taking one." "You're always taking one," she replied. Another alert sounded, this one quieter, more distant. She pulled away, fast. Cooling system stabilized. "But that wasn't just sabotage," she said. "It was a trap. Coordinated." Kael pushed to his feet, wiping his face with the back of his arm. "Then whoever's coming next, isn't trying to fry us. They're trying to slow us down." Seryn nodded, already moving. The heat may have broken, but the storm hadn't even started. The shadows moved first. Barely a sound. Just the whisper of a boot sliding across steel. The kind of silence that screams to someone trained to hear it. Kael froze mid-step, one hand on the bulkhead, breath caught in his throat. The emergency lights had cut again, plunging the auxiliary corridor into blackness broken only by the occasional flicker of dying panels. Seryn stood 5 meters ahead, back against the wall, her silhouette merging with shadow like she belonged to it. Motion sensors were pinging irregularly. Intermittent. Ghosts. "We're not alone," she whispered through the comm. Kael didn't respond. He didn't need to. The air had shifted, dense, electric. Even the ship seemed to know. The hum of the engine dropped a register, as though bracing. They moved in silence. No light. No sound beyond their own controlled breathing. Step by step down the darkened artery of the vessel. Then a shape. Just a flicker, barely there, a shimmer in the edge of vision. Kael dropped. A pulse bolt whined past where his head had been a second before, scorching the bulkhead with a sizzling burn mark. Another shot. Then another. Seryn was already in motion, darting between structural ribs, gun drawn. She didn't fire, yet. Her eyes scanned, hunted. "Flanking," Kael said quietly. He cut right, slipping through a side passage filled with exposed coolant piping and flickering wall panels. The air here was colder. Thinner. His boots barely touched the grated floor as he moved. Ahead, a door hissed halfway open, jammed. He squeezed through sideways, scraping his shoulder, and came out behind the attacker. Human-sized. Armored in matte obsidian plating. Helmeted. Silent. Kael didn't hesitate. He launched forward, driving a shoulder into the back of the intruder's knee. The figure staggered, turned too late. Kael's fist met the helmet's side. A grunt. The rifle clattered away. They slammed into the wall. Then Seryn was there. She didn't ask questions. Just drove a blade up beneath the ribs with surgical precision. The body dropped. "Not Veilran spec," she muttered, crouching to examine the armor. Kael knelt beside her. "Mercenary. Too coordinated. Too clean. This isn't random." A sudden beep. Soft. Insistent. She reached under the armor and pulled free a data drive, small, transparent, still warm. "What is it?" Kael asked. Seryn's eyes narrowed as she scanned the identifier. "Encrypted communications relay," she said. "They weren't here to kill us. They were transmitting." "To who?" Seryn stood, jaw tight. "To whoever wants to stop us from reaching Volseren." Kael looked at the corpse again. "They're ahead of us now." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started walking fast, boots echoing sharp on the metal floor. "Where are we going?" "To the NAV bay," she called over her shoulder. "If they've rerouted our trajectory, we'll never make it out of this sector." They reached the core navigation chamber, a sphere of translucent interfaces floating above a deep subdeck well. The lights here were still functioning, casting their faces in a low cerulean glow. Seryn typed fast. Her brow furrowed. They embedded a split loop, subtle, almost elegant. Redirecting our autopilot just off Volseren's orbit. Kael leaned beside her. "How far off?" "Far enough to drift us into a mining corridor occupied by 2 kill satellites. We'd have never made it." "You can undo it." She met his eyes. "Yes. But I have to take down the override manually." "I'll cover you." She paused. "You sure?" "I'm not leaving you in the dark," he said. Her eyes flicked to his burned arms, the bruise under his jaw from earlier, the dried blood on his knuckles. Then she nodded. Together they moved. The override shaft was deep, like descending into the spine of the ship. Ladders lined the shaft walls. The hum of power grew louder with every meter. They passed access rungs, vent ports, magnetic relays. Below, the emergency breaker was glowing faintly red. As Seryn dropped the final meter to the override panel, Kael landed beside her. 10 seconds to unlock, she said. Kael raised his weapon. "Make it 8. She grinned. "Watch me." Fingers flew. The screen flared. Code scrolled. And then, behind them, footsteps. Fast. Kael spun, fired. Missed. The attacker launched out of the dark, another black-suited operative, faster than the first. They collided, weapon to weapon, Kael's rifle knocked aside. Fists. Knees. Elbows. Steel against bone. Armor against skin. Kael fought like instinct, no thought, no hesitation. But the operative was relentless. Then Seryn moved. She threw herself into the fray, blade drawn. The attacker grabbed her wrist. Kael struck. 1 hit. 2. And the enemy dropped. They stood over the body, breathing hard. Then the override pinged. Navigation restored, the AI chimed calmly. Seryn looked at Kael. That was close. He nodded, wiping sweat and blood from his face. They're going to keep coming. Let them, she said. Now they know we're not easy prey. She stepped closer. Her voice lowered. You okay? He nodded. Still standing. Her hand brushed his. Just once. Good, she whispered. Because we're not done yet. Silence wrapped the NAV chamber like a second skin. The kind of silence that didn't soothe, it pressed. Breathing became deliberate. Movement, waited. Seryn leaned against the central console, pulse still racing. Her eyes didn't leave the map, even as her hand trembled slightly at her side. Kael watched her. Not the way he had before, guarded, wary. This time, he watched her like she was something volatile and beautiful and necessary. Like the calm before a detonation. We should rest, he said finally, voice low. They're regrouping. So should we. She didn't argue. They moved together through the dim halls, past sealed compartments and flickering status panels. The ship groaned beneath them, tired but alive. When they reached her quarters, she paused at the door. It slid open with a hush. The room inside was low-lit, warmer than the rest of the ship. Shadows danced across clean metal and softened surfaces. At the far end, framed photos flickered on a wall-mounted console, frozen moments of Kael in places he thought had been private. He stopped. Stared. You watched me, he said. Seryn didn't flinch. I studied you. For 8 months. She nodded. He turned to face her fully. Why? She looked away for the first time. Because you were unpredictable. And because. Her voice trailed off. Kael stepped closer. Say it. She exhaled. Because I didn't want to stop watching. Silence again. But it wasn't the suffocating kind. It was the kind that hummed with questions too heavy to speak. He stepped in. She didn't back away. I'm not a case study, he said. No, she whispered. You're the variable I couldn't control. Then she kissed him. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't strategy. It was surrender wrapped in fire. And he answered with the same burn, hands in her hair, breath between them, skin flushed and real. They hit the couch in a tangle of limbs and quiet gasps. Layers stripped. Heat pressed close. This wasn't the battlefield. But it was just as dangerous. They moved like magnets, pushed, pulled, anchored. Each touch a declaration, each breath a promise not yet spoken aloud. Later, tangled in half-lit sheets, Seryn rested against his chest. Her voice, for once, was small. I didn't plan for this. He brushed his fingers along her spine. That's why it matters. She looked up at him. We're fugitives. Outnumbered. Hunted. I know. And you're still here. He nodded. I'm done running. A long pause. Then we finish it, she said. Kael kissed her forehead. Together. In the quiet that followed, two hearts beat out of sync but never out of time. Outside, the stars kept moving. And so would they. The alarm sounded low, different from the others. Not urgent. Not warning. It sounded like inevitability. Kael snapped awake, heart already racing. Seryn was on her feet in an instant, bare skin wrapped in half a flight suit, eyes locked on the blinking red icon pulsing across the console near her bed. Incoming signal, she said, voice tight. Not a scout. Kael swung into his pants, grabbing the sidearm from the floor. Then what? Warship. The word landed with weight. Outside the hull, the tactical display flared to life. A vessel 10 times their size drifted into range, sleek, silent, unmarked. But Kael recognized the design. Everyone did. High command. They're not here to negotiate, he said. Seryn was already moving. They think we're vulnerable. This is their final push. He followed her into the hallway. Red emergency lights chased them through the ship, illuminating scorched metal and blood-stained decks. The damage from the last incursion hadn't been repaired. There hadn't been time. At the bridge, the ship's AI spoke. Hostile lock engaged. Docking procedure initializing. Estimated breach, 4 minutes. Seryn's hands flew across the interface. No way we can outrun them, Kael said. We're not going to. He gave her a look. She answered with fire. We trapped them. She mapped out a new sequence, rerouting internal heat through the docking umbilical. If they dock, the surge fries their systems. But only if timed right. Kael took the weapons locker offline, rearming himself in silence. They're expecting a crippled ship, he said. She nodded. Let's give them a fight instead. The lights flickered. 30 seconds, the AI intoned. Kael stepped beside her, checked her sidearm. You ready? Seryn looked up at him. I don't want to lose you, she said, fast, like it hurt. You won't, he said. Not today. The ship rocked. A heavy clang reverberated down the corridor. Docking clamps engaged, the AI confirmed. External airlock compromised. Seryn slammed her palm to the override. Do it now. Kael hit the trigger. A deep groan echoed through the vessel as the redirected heat channeled into the umbilical. Sparks danced across the bridge view. Static bled into comms. Then, an explosion. The enemy's bridge tube detonated in a burst of white fire. First wave disabled, Seryn breathed. But that won't stop them all. Footsteps in the corridor. The real fight had arrived. They turned together. And ran straight into war. Shots flew fast, blue plasma slicing through the dark. Kael ducked behind a bulkhead, returning fire in rapid bursts. Seryn moved like a shadow, silent and lethal. One attacker went down. Another followed. Kael reloaded. Second breach in 20 seconds. Fall back to engineering. Seryn ordered. They sprinted. Slid through a collapsing bulkhead as the deck behind them exploded. Smoke. Fire. Screams. Inside engineering, Kael activated the fail-safes, powering the magnetic locks. This is our line, he said. Seryn didn't respond. She was staring at the main reactor. If they reach the core. They won't, he promised. The doors burst open. And the final breach began. Smoke still lingered. Not the kind that billowed. Not angry. Just, present. Clinging to the air like a memory. The lights on the bridge pulsed dimly, flickering in and out like a heartbeat trying to hold rhythm. Kael stood at the viewport, one arm braced against the frame, eyes locked on the edge of space. Debris drifted outside, twisted metal, fractured plating, pieces of what was supposed to be their end. But they were still here. Behind him, Seryn exhaled. She sat in the command chair, legs pulled up to her chest, bare arms streaked with soot and dried blood. "You should rest," Kael said quietly, still facing the void. "I can't." Her voice was low. Rough. He turned. She looked at him like she hadn't stopped seeing him since the warships arrived. Something raw sat behind her gaze now, not fear. Not even pain. Truth. "You did it," he said. "We're alive." "No." Her lips twisted, bitter. "We survived." "That's not the same." He crossed the bridge and sat beside her on the floor. They didn't touch, not yet. Just breathed together. "You were ready to die," he said. "I was." Her hands clenched around her knees. But not alone. That silence returned, their silence. The kind that had grown between them like roots. Tangled. Steady. "You said once you were trained not to want anything permanent," he said. Seryn nodded. "Desire is weakness. Attachment is liability." He studied her face, bruised and worn but more real than anything he'd ever known. "Then what are we?" She didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, she reached into her flight vest and pulled out a black data chip. Sleek. Unlabeled. Deadly. "This is the full archive," she said. "From Seryn. Everything. Genetic culls, breeding restrictions, death quotas. Names. Orders. Timelines." Kael stared at it. It could bring down command. "It could start a civil war," she said. "Maybe worse." He looked up. "And you're giving it to me?" "No," she replied. "I'm giving it to us. Because the moment I saw you strapped into that neural interface, gritting your teeth while the machine read your soul, I knew. This wasn't just about me anymore." Kael took the chip slowly. Held it like it might bite. Then he laughed once. Dry. "All this because you didn't want to die alone." She smirked. "I said I didn't plan to fall for you, remember?" "You didn't fall," he said, gently. "You chose. And so did I." The light stabilized overhead. The ship stopped groaning. Systems rebalanced. Engines idled, no longer screaming for attention. He leaned closer. "So what now?" Seryn looked past him, toward the dead zone of stars beyond their orbit. "We find a place to land. We hide. We broadcast. You think the truth will save anyone?" "No," she said. "But it might give someone a reason to fight." He offered his hand. She took it. Fingers laced. Not a grip of survival. A promise. Outside, the debris field thinned. The last fragments of the past drifted away. What remained was forward. Unknown. Dangerous. And entirely theirs. They didn't need a name for it. But it felt like a beginning. Somewhere between the edge of war and the silence that follows, they found something that couldn't be named. Not love, not yet. Not peace, not ever. But something forged in blood and heat, bound in breath and betrayal. A human with a mind that wouldn't break. An alien soldier who had never been allowed to want. Together, they didn't escape. They chose. To carry the truth. To stay hidden. To resist. Not with legions. Not with fleets. But with each other. Two fugitives adrift on a ship no longer hunted, just haunted. Not all revolutions need a name. Some begin with a door sealed shut, a hand held firm, and the sound of two people breathing in the dark. Together, they drifted, not away from war, but into the one they would start. And this time, they wouldn't fight alone.